Okay, thanks to all the speakers. And now if everyone can come back online and on camera, on mic, we want to open up with some discussion. And lots of questions have come in. There are more coming in, and I put out a call for everyone out there. There's additional questions. I think we'll have time for it. Send them on in. I know there were some video difficulties with Kerry's, and I think a little bit with Rick's video. So we will try and get that fixed for the YouTube version that goes out online. So. Let's see, let me bring up the questions here. I'd like to start with actually the speakers and see if they had any questions of either of the panel members. I think you guys put some effort into those talks clearly, and just anything that struck you or you wanted to ask your co-presenters there. I know I'm putting you on the spot.
I have a question I think this would be a good question for Kerry, at least from my standpoint from public affairs, where you do a lot of effort to try to reach people. And Kerry mentioned, using things like Reels right now is sort of the best on Instagram's algorithm, because Instagram sort of is invested in trying to compete with TikTok. But what's a way to stay in touch with some of the social media platforms sort of always changing algorithms, so that the postings that you're doing are going to kind of be maximized as best they can, because it seems like things do change over time depending on what the company's focus is. And is there any insight you can provide to trying to stay sort of in the loop on those changing algorithms?
Well, even that's definitely something that is hard to keep on top of. One of the ways that I do it, honestly, is with the new Clubhouse app, because there's all sorts of amazing groups on Clubhouse that are following these kinds of things and talking about these kinds of things on a daily basis. So while I'm going about doing something else, some other task or something, I might be in a Clubhouse room on marketing where they're talking about the latest features in Instagram or something like that. So yeah, it's not easy to keep on top of these things, but it is important to do so, because you don't want to be spinning your wheels and putting a whole bunch of effort into something that's not working as well as it used to. And you need to know kind of what is working well on social media right now. And it does change.
Great, thanks, Kerry. And maybe to Kerry and Travis, there was a question that came up about, are there challenges working with government agencies, state, local, federal, tribal, in reaching all these platforms and doing it in maybe an agile way or a very quick response way? Any thoughts on that? And how do you overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge. It's a challenge for public information officers, who are typically the ones who are managing the social media for a government agency, and they are pulled in 100 different directions. The agencies, I think, who excel at it are those who definitely have at least one person assigned to the social media part. A few years back, it used to be kind of a luxury and extra. But now you've got to nail social media, in my opinion. You've got to be good at it. You've got to know the platforms and be able to reach people where they are. They are not necessarily coming to your website, but you want to be showing up in their feeds. And by that, you need to kind of know what it is. Now, I know there's a lot of resistance on the part of public agencies to TikTok, for example, probably with good reason. But I think Instagram Reels is a great alternative to that. It's kind of a knockoff, and it's a very good way to get information out. And the nice thing about some of these platforms and some of what's working is it doesn't have to be long. It can be short. It can be 15 or 30 seconds to get the message out. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in this whole area of air quality monitoring and air quality public education to be creative and, do some great communications on these platforms.
Great. Travis, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of echo Kerry's thought there a little bit about sort of the availability of resources, particularly staff time. At my agency, I am the public affairs department. So all social media is kind of in my house, all sort of public engagement on facilities that are going hearings, as well as sort of SIP planning, state information planning for bringing areas of our region that might be in non-attainment and the plans to bring those back into attainment. All of those are kind of in my area, and the time and effort I can devote to social media is certainly limited. So it's kind of would be government agencies as a whole sort of understanding that and prioritizing social media efforts to get to people a little bit better.
Great. Annie, there were a number of questions about uncertainty. And I think some people had problems using uncertainty. Does it represent, hey, we really don't know? Or someone said, we really don't have a clue. What are your thoughts on that? And how do you overcome that? How do you get around that?
Yeah, I think there's a significant conception, especially among scientists, that people just won't understand uncertainty. It's going to be too confusing, and it's going to reduce people's trust in any information that you're presenting. And I think a lot of, especially visualization research, has kind of turned that on its head and kind of exposed that when people are empowered to look at uncertainty information, it's actually more beneficial and they understand it more deeply. I think in my study in particular, when I was showing the designs to the users, I didn't really use the word uncertainty. It was presented kind of whatever wording was best for each view. So for a view where I showed multiple outcomes, I talked about the most likely scenario, or sorry, best case, worst case, most likely. And people are really able to use that kind of reasoning. I think where the most distrust and doubt came in was when they kind of saw the uncertainty themselves. So when you showed a view with a contour plot with the sensors on top, because of the uncertainty in the sensor data and because all the values are binned into these groups, you would inevitably get a mismatch between the colored areas and the colored dots. And then when people saw that kind of implicit uncertainty that wasn't explicitly accounted for, then that's when they started to not like the idea of the uncertainty.
Great. Let's see, next, Rick. A question about, you were talking about risk, and it's all different and it's personal. And I guess I'm wondering if you were in charge and thinking about there's a bunch of low cost sensor companies out there that are building products, and what are a couple of things that you would tell them to change in their products? Like if you were in charge and you had control over 4 or 5 of these companies, what would you tell them to do? A couple of things related to.
I think one thing I would do is I would poll my customers and find out what it is that they want these sensors to be able to answer, to address. What questions are they trying to resolve, and adapt the technology based on those responses. People buy these things. When they first started 15 years ago, they bought them as little novelties on their desk. But now people are starting to ask genuine and legitimate and important questions about their personal lifestyle, about risk, whatever it is. Everybody's risk perception is different, of course. And so everybody's going to use these things in different ways. And I don't think we fully understand why people are using and buying and building these kinds of sensors and what they're doing with them. And so I think as we're moving towards better and better low-cost sensors in the marketplace, that there is room for movement for industries to build products that are designed to answer the questions that people want to answer. Not just a new shiny new device that you can put on a slick website, but something that is purpose-driven.
Great. Travis, there were a series of questions, a little bit more technical, asking about how did you all come up with the correction algorithm that's used for purple air? And maybe we could kind of fast track some of these, but that was one, and I'll ask the others.
I can't speak to sort of the exact process that our monitoring department sort of did, but there was some question a little bit of the motivation behind. Back in 2017, 2017 is when we first sort of stumbled onto purple airs. They were still kind of newer devices at the time. And our monitoring department oftentimes will purchase some of these commercial grade sensors and sort of test run them, so to speak. And we were impressed with sort of the accuracy that they had compared to our nephelometers. We did find there was a bit of a high bias. And the initial idea from the agency at the time was, would this be an easy way to install some sensors at local schools across our county as a way to sort of engage teachers and engage students as an opportunity to talk about air quality? Began around, well, how can we account for some of this high bias? And that's where monitoring department sort of came up with the conversion, had a little bit of conversation with Purple Air. And now when you go to Purple's websites, there's a few of them, one from like Utah, one from Australia, EPA. But for a long time, even last year, LRAPA was the only conversion option on there. It was something that we found very useful and a way to account for that high bias. And then we expanded our network beyond sort of the schools as we found interest from the public on it. So the motivation, I guess, behind it was because it didn't really exist at the time when we discovered Purple Air, and we're trying to account for that. And we ended up where we're at now.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's see, a couple other questions for you. One was, how much time does it take, or staff does it take, to manage 90 Purple Airs? You know, maintenance, data review.
The staff time is actually pretty low. That's another thing that kind of I take on my shoulders a lot as well. The difficulty can be finding someone who has the ability to host it. With Purple Air specifically, it just requires a plug outdoors, and then it has to be within range of a wireless signal. At times that can be tough to find a wireless signal that's strong enough outside where there's also access to sort of the outlet to plug it in. But once it's set up and it's running, it's pretty effortless to maintain. Occasionally one will go down, at which point we'll reach out, and that takes me to kind of drive out there to wherever it may be and swap it out with the new one. And then as far as data retrieval, that's pretty straightforward and easy as well. We have Purple Air sort of has all of the data there that's accessible on their website. And then our monitoring department we'll go in and sort of download data that we have from Excel, so we have it in-house as well. And with 90 sensors, that does take time to kind of go through each one, but an hour or two to kind of get through that on a once-a-month basis. It's just sort of the last time it was done, we have to go back in and do it again. But there's not maintenance required behind it once it's set up and installed, and the installation isn't too terribly difficult, maybe about an hour or so to get it up and running.
Great. Annie, Kevin, also talking about kind of sensors and adding them into your work. I noticed, I think I interpreted the plot right. It said when you added in sensors, there was an increase in distrust. Can you expand on that? I mean, what was it? And maybe give us a little narrative of like what people might have been saying and what their thinking was behind that.
Yeah, I think in general, people want to either just engage very quickly with a piece of information or kind of really dig into it. And so one of the benefits of showing uncertainty can be that they spend more time thinking about it and understanding. But when there's ambiguity there, they're both spending time thinking about it and not really coming up with a clear conclusion. So when you show the most likely interpolation, again, it's often not going to exactly match with every single piece of sensor data there because of fluctuations in the individual sensor readings. And so people see that mismatch between the most likely scenario and the data that's being input more explicitly, whereas usually that's kind of papered over for people. So I think, I can't remember any specific examples of what people said, but I feel like especially people that had more higher education or more quantitative background, in that case, we're then saying, okay, well, what algorithm did they use to make the contour? And then they were bringing in more of their outside knowledge. And the more that people bring in their own exterior knowledge, that's not something that's directly encoded, the more variable their interpretations are going to be because it depends on that person's experience.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then there was also a question about just the demographics of the people you talk to. Could you just characterize that for all of us?
Yeah, my study, so it's definitely limited. So as everybody in the study had a bachelor's degree, and most people also had something above that in a quantitative field. So one of the pieces of feedback from reviewers is that it would be great to do a much bigger study with a larger population.
Okay, all right, great, thank you. Kerry and Rick, there was a question that came through. Do you have any advice on what would be the best way to engage a community in everyday conversation about air quality? And I think there was also, what are the steps to doing that? But there was also this notion of, could we measure their interaction somehow? And they were talking about screen time, you know, with an app, we get screen time or we get steps. Like, are there ways to measure? Are there actions? Have you seen anything like that? Any thoughts on that? Rick, do you want to start?
Well, I haven't seen a whole lot. I'm sure that there are some studies out there looking at engagement, but I know that this is a metric that we are, at least in the academic world, we're starting to include this in our analyses, where we're not just creating an app that reports a value or a color. We're seeing what they do before and after. Sometimes we're integrating, you know, some kind of health testing involved in it as well. And we want to see how they respond to this messaging. I think we don't know what the right message is. And unfortunately, some of the messages have to be varied depending on who they are, what thing they're suffering. For example, the way you would message somebody that that is being impacted by typical photochemical smog in a big city might be different than somebody who's being impacted by wildfire smoke. Those require two different messages, and we don't really know how to discriminate between those two just yet. I think this is an area where we're just starting to learn how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
May I comment? What I'd like to see is a great deal of thought put into the variegation of messages going to different communities. For instance, in San Francisco, an awful lot of the public service messages are in English, Spanish, Tagalog, and I believe Mandarin. There are also people who don't read very well. They would respond to and need different sorts of visual and spoken languages concerning communicating air quality data than a cohort, all of whom have bachelor's degrees, who are experienced in reading sophisticated graphs. I think this is a field that we'll see more study in the future.
Kerry, thoughts on
I don't know if I have too much more to add. I mean, that was all really good. Yeah, it's just identifying who your audience is that you're trying to reach, and then making sure you're reaching them in the most effective way with the right kind of messaging that's going to motivate them. And that does take a little work to kind of figure that out.
Yeah, I guess on that note, maybe this is a comment for kind of everybody. Rick, I was struck, and I think others had commented on your talking points, that were exactly that, is clear what's happening. And I bet they're probably hard to create. They're going to be specific and application specific, maybe geographic specific. But is there any effort, or has anyone done kind of effort to assemble a compendium of talking points so people could look at that and go, oh, I like that, I want to modify that? Any thoughts on that, or is there anything out there that's...
I've never seen a compendium or some kind of template for talking points for specific for quality, but we all have created these talking points, but just not in a talking point form. We will call them a conclusion. And so the conclusion of our research study or our measurement campaign or whatever we're doing to create this data, we write it in the academic world, at least we'll write a couple of paragraphs of what our conclusions are. If you can synthesize that down to a couple of bullet points, that's your talking point. And I suspect no matter where you come from, whether you're in a regulator or you're from an industry, you have the same kinds of conclusions, you have the same kinds of objectives, the message that you're trying to convey to your intended audience. We just don't refine them down to bullet points. And it's a simple trick where if you literally, when I do press interviews, I literally have a Post-it stuck to my screen of the 3 or 4 talking points that I want to reiterate, and keep that same message going and going to try to change that personal truth, to make that message just absolutely crystal clear, using vivid language to get the point across that's constrained to these 2 or 3 or 4 bullet points. We use the data to support that. Those are characters in your story. But ultimately, what I want to do is tell you those 3 bullet points. That's your take-home message.
Great. Others?
I wonder if we could, you know, see an augmentation of the Air Now gas gauge visual representation, that augmented by a relatively standardized set of talking points precisely appropriate to certain levels of AQI problems, and see that presented in multiple languages of
Hey, Rebecca, I'd like to get a chance to hear from some of the. Okay, thanks. Other thoughts on that from other panelists?
At least when it comes to discussing these talking points on air quality information, particularly on the AQI scale, at least from a clean air standpoint, LRAPA and Oregon Department of Environmental Quality and a lot of the clean air agencies that are scattered throughout Washington as well as in California, we are in communication with each other fairly often and coordinate a lot of our messaging on those type items. And we sort of have related talking points specifically on the AQI scale and the recommendation to people of, you know, actions to take depending on what that air quality index is showing them, coordination with our local public health agencies. So from a government standpoint, a lot of those, there's not necessarily a big pile of them all located in the same place, but it's sort of these same talking points do kind of exist, and there's discussions around them from agency to agency. Things do get complicated on the AQI, specifically when you start to get up to the Washington area, because they sort of have their own scale that they follow, and that can create, you know, a little bit of points of confusion as well. But from a government standpoint, there's a lot of discussion and coordination on sort of what we say for each category. So that does kind of exist in that sense.
Great. Anyone else?
I'd also add to what Travis said, that governments also have a little bit of a hesitation to embrace low-cost sensors because they don't have a legal mandate to use them. And the EPA prescribes, in the US at least, FRMs and FEMs as the measurement tool. And if it's not an FRM or an FEM, it's not appropriate for discussion. I think that paradigm is shifting, but regulators are relatively slow to do that for good reason. I think there was a question about a certification process, you know, whether a certification process for sensors is imminent or forthcoming. I think there are movements to make those certification processes sort of an FEM light certification, if you will. But until that point happens, governments often are reluctant to talk broadly about this kind of information because it's based on, you know, low-cost technologies which aren't fully vetted and fully understood, and it puts them in an awkward predicament. And so I can understand why governments are a little hesitant to embrace them. And I applaud people like Travis for taking this kind of thing, and others on this webinar to taking these low-cost sensors and making meaningful messages out of it. That's a good thing. But I can also understand that they are a little reluctant to do so sometimes.
Yeah, I can just to real quickly sort of expand on that a little bit. LRAPA, I don't want to say is unique in sort of our Purple Air Network expansion that we sort of have done, but it is something that we have kind of embraced. And it started from an attempt to sort of create some school programming to engage, you know, children with some curriculum, and then that branched out to people just sort of had an interest. We would get a request, or someone would call us up with air quality concerns, and we'd, well, let's install a purple air sensor. And while they're not as accurate as our FRM monitors, we feel that they're accurate enough with the conversion factor for people to make sort of meaningful decisions, especially during wildfire season, which is becoming more common in Oregon, to make meaningful actions and when they should stay indoors. And another sort of aside on that is, at least the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality is coming up with a sensor, sort of in-house sensor they're creating called the Sense-OR or Sensor. that's a low cost sensor that they're creating, not an FRM monitor to install. That's kind of like an Oregon DEQ version of Purple Air. So there's kind of that's taking place as well.
I want to, we've got about 4 minutes. Okay. A question just came in for Travis and Kerry, and it's related to someone working in a government agency, but the Air Quality Communications Department is reluctant to be more creative and fun, and they slowly integrate new tools like social media. Any tips for this person? Looks like Amy Tai. So any tips for Amy?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, whoops, where's my mic? Here it is. I'm just trying to read Amy's question here and see what that's all about. But yeah, part of it is, I understand there are agencies which are maybe slower to adopt some technologies, but I think it's just a kind of an ongoing education process. And I always like to put the word pilot in front of something. So if you can sell that to management, let's try a pilot and see what kind of reaction we get on this platform to it. And then it doesn't sound quite so scary as a big commitment. But yeah, government does tend to lag behind on these things. But on some of these platforms, if you're one of the early ones there, you can really get a lot of traction really quick. So I don't know, just my initial thoughts on that. A lot of these questions are amazing. I love the people at this conference because, they're thinking deeply and all of that. And it's hard to answer in 30 seconds for a lot of these, but just initial thoughts.
Say on that, yeah, because I run our social media for a government agency, and we are only focused on Twitter and Facebook, and we do not have an Instagram account. We do not do any of those things. And from my perspective as public affairs manager, I'm not opposed to that, and I agree with Rick. I think that being on those accounts and getting that information out is important. From my perspective, that's just another social media account that needs to be managed and content has to be created for, and I do not have the time or capacity to really bring that on. Yeah. And so movement on that sort of would require a real reshuffling of priorities from an agency to focus on that, and that takes a lot of time.
Okay, great. I think the last question here is going to be on accuracy and uncertainty. And let me kind of go around. But Annie, is there any group out there who's doing really one of the best jobs trying to communicate complex information with uncertainty and accurately as possible? Who is that group that we should model after?
I was muted. I'm not sure that there are really any, in terms of government agencies, that really incorporate information into their visuals. It's hard for this stuff to kind of make the leap from the research world to the real world. Mm-hmm. So especially with air quality, there's really not a lot that I know of. There's some really cool research that mine was kind of inspired by, looking at if you made an app that helps people know when their bus is going to come. And if that app, and it kind of addresses one of the other questions that I think was brought up, which is why not just say, like, there's this percentage of this air quality. And in that experiment, they looked at just telling people, oh, there's a 90% chance your bus is going to come by this time, versus showing them a dot plot of when the bus might come. And looking at the plot really helped people make much more optimal decisions. And that felt like something that could be almost, it's close to being maybe a real world application. But yeah, a lot of this stuff is very theoretical so far.
Great. Travis, accuracy question for you. You talked about reaching out to the public. Does proximity matter? Like, oh, this sensor is close to me, but it's not as accurate, or does accuracy matter more? Which matters more to the public you work with?
In my experience, I feel people care more about the closest sensor to them. One of the things with our FRM monitors is they do capture air quality pretty robustly, and a single FRM monitor sort of in the Eugene area does a pretty good job at sort of encompassing what the air quality is for pretty much the majority of that community. But people aren't they would much rather see that less accurate purple air sensor that's a block away from them, as opposed to the FRM monitor that's a half mile away from them. So I think they prioritize location significantly more.
Great. And I think the last question was, there was one about trying to convince people to believe and listen that the data is accurate. Do Kerry and Rick, how do we try and convince people?
I don't try to convince people that the data is accurate.
Yeah.
I think, well, hopefully there's not a ton of question. I mean, I think people might just by default think, okay, this data is out there. Yeah, it's going to be accurate. It's going to be pretty accurate. I don't know. Rick, what do you think?
I can understand the accuracy and precision of these sensors, but I can't portray it as well as people like Annie can. That's what her research is in conveying this uncertainty and imprecision in ways that are more meaningful. But I also recognize that I have a background that doesn't kind of put me in the same analytical category as the general public, because this is what I do for a living.
Yeah.
And so making that leap to something that anybody can read on the cover of Time magazine is certainly not my forte. But I do look to people like Annie, because they messy stuff that we produce and put it out there so for public consumption. I pointed out that at the beginning of my little video was actually a graphic from a major newspaper that actually has a renowned data visualization department, if you will. And it was an awful visual. And that was from one of the world's renowned data visualization specialists. But that's what goes out there. And we need to listen to people like Annie, because we're not very good at it.
Great job with that video, by the way. And I think that's a lesson is, you know, the technical and science side has got to work with the less technical public information and communication side. We've got to work together, because working together, we can come up with messaging that the public will understand. We can preserve the scientific integrity, but also make sure it's communicated well.
Great.
So Annie, how can eggheads like me, or eggheads like the 200 people in this webinar who are producing this data, how can we produce more meaningful data that you can turn into this really effective and impactful message?
More meaningful data specifically? I mean, I guess sorry?
Sure. What can we do better to produce data sets that it's easier for you to help visualize and craft that message more broadly?
I feel like, I mean, such a big barrier is just the data wrangling and processing side of things. And especially with government agency data, a lot of the time, it's not really clear where it is on the website. And then the uncertainties in the data are often not explicitly laid out or quantified. So I feel like there's a lot of room for just kind of interfaces for the general public or researchers to grab polished data more quickly would just facilitate a lot more happening.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up. Let's see, Travis, thank you. Where can people find you? Do you have an email address or?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. It's just my name, Travis @lrapa.org, which I'll put kind of in the chat here for people. That's the best way to get in touch with me.
Great. Annie, thank you so much. And where can people find you?
You can email me, Annie@climatecheck.com.
Great. Rick, thank you. And same question. Okay. And Kerry, thank you very much. And where can people find you?
Just in the process of putting it in the chat, but okay. Yeah, I'll have that in the chat in a second. Follow me on Instagram @the_Livestream_expert.
Okay, great. I'd like to thank UC Davis and Sandra for organizing this, and my co-presenter, Rebecca, or co-chair, Rebecca. Thanks, everybody, and look forward to the next ASIC and hearing more. Bye, all.